Hey, so I know Halloween's over, but I make the rules around here anyway, and I watched this movie on Netflix called Night Teeth, and I don't really want to make any comments on that, but it did make me start to wonder about vampires. I've never really thought about them, I just accepted them as like, yeah, they're vampires, they suck blood, right? And that's pretty much it. But I've never really thought about their history, so I decided to do a modest dive. Nothing Olympic, just a modest dive on vampires, and it's pretty weird. It gets a bit strange. Starts out pretty weird, honestly, so let's just go back to way back in Romania, long time ago, right? Forever ago. They had these bad boys called strigoi, and that's just Latin for meaning evil spirit, and they're definitely the source of the vampires that we knew, but originally strigoi had kind of a different palate, you know? They, rather than drinking blood, they were usually blamed for drinking milk from cows and also milk from mothers. Those saucy boys, they would just pop up in the middle of the night whispering, "Yo quiero leche." Really makes me think that vampires were just ghoulish excuses that farm people had to cover up their affairs. It's like, Janice, what happened? What's your shirt doing off? And who just jumped out the window? It's like, Harold, you know, those strigoi are just unstoppable milk thieves. Meanwhile, the neighbor Tim is just strolling home, not a care in the world, with a belly full of mammary milkshakes. Anyways, one thing that's really stood the test of time with these vampires is that they've always hated garlic. And these Romanians would smear garlic on the horns of the cows so that way they would, you know, ward off any strigoi from coming and taking the cow's milk. If only they did something like that for the mothers, but they didn't. The thing about garlic is that it was always viewed as a cure for pretty much any ailment, right? And also, as you know, it has a pretty strong smell. And this comes into play since there's diseases that people can catch in which strong scents are then perceived as extremely repulsive and painful, you know? Such is the case with this one disease called porphyria, in which case that is one symptom, as well as other negative symptoms such as, you know, you can't go out in the sun, you get like skin blemishes, all sorts of things start to happen. So yeah, porphyria was coined as the vampire disease, but I'm not gonna get too specific onto, you know, different diseases that are theorized to, you know, partake in the development of, you know, vampire storylines in the past, because it really gets muddy and it becomes a, you know, who came first, the chicken or the egg kind of scenario. Was there already this historical, you know, lore on vampires, and then there were diseases that, you know, they correlated with them, like, oh, these are similarities that they have and that they then call them after that? Or were there just diseases that had these symptoms and then they just created this entire storyline about vampires as a result of the disease? Which, if that is the case, I think that is hilarious, because just imagine if it was today's day and age and there was just some random disease that had like a slew of extremely unfortunate symptoms and it just cripples a person tremendously, and rather than, you know, people just saying, oh yeah, Fred, he's ill, that's a shame, right? Rather than that, they say, Fred, he is a supernatural being of darkness. And so they create this subculture and folklore around him, and then society then fetishizes him so much that he becomes a cornerstone in teen romance. Okay, I guess, but I just think it's ridiculous. But the history of the correlation with disease and vampirism gets even better, though. When diseases were running through a town, they didn't really know what diseases were themselves, so they just assumed it was vampires doing this, that vampires were leaving their graves to go suck blood and life energy from the living. That's where the whole sleeping in the coffin part even came from. They were thinking that these strigoi possess the body in the grave, and then they come out, take all the milk and blood, and go back, have a feast. It's been a grand old time. And these town folk had all the proof that they needed. You see, when this would happen, Kevin and the boys would go grab a shovel, head over to the cemetery, dig up some graves, pop open a coffin, and what would they find? That's right, a strigoi, baby. Because they didn't really know death all that well. They would just see the teeth looking bigger because the gums are pulled up. They see the nails looking longer because the skin's shriveled back. So they're like, yeah, it's a strigoi. But no, it's just a decomposing body. It's your Aunt Meredith. Leave her alone. And then you know what they would do to stop these vampires from sucking up all the milk and blood from that town? They thought they were heroes. They would then grab a wooden stake and shove it right through the chest of that decomposing corpse. And the point of that was they would pin the vampire into the coffin so it can't move, which I just find ridiculous, because if you're telling me that your theory is that the strigoi possesses that body, digs itself up out of a 6-foot grave, ransacks a town from all the milk and blood it can desire, and then it just makes its way back to the cemetery and buries itself back underground, before that sunrise like some sort of demonic Cinderella, and you think putting a piece of wood in its chest is going to stop it, I think it might be a bit more powerful than that. I think we might need to give it a little bit more credit if that's actually what it can do. Anyways, I digress. This impaling aspect, though, does bring us to one of the most important figures that we need to talk about in regards to vampires and the way they ended up being portrayed in our society for all the years to come. And this is none other than Vlad the Impaler, aka Vlad Dracul III, aka Vlad You Are Draculist, aka Count Dracula, baby. Well, sort of. Not really, but I mean, kind of. Yes, it's based off him, but it's not really based off him. We'll get into that in a second. But you see, this guy was a ruler in this area near Transylvania, and he was truly an awful guy. He was just the worst. You would not really want to meet him, or if you did, maybe would not meet him again, probably. There were a lot of battles and wars in his region, and the way that he would handle prisoners of war, as well as people that just broke the law in general, is by impaling them. Because he had these giant rods, right? And he would just skewer people right through the chest like shish kebabs. It was his favorite thing to do. It was practically his hobby. Some people like baking, maybe some people like working on cars, or maybe some crochet, I don't know. This guy just impaled people. It was it. But if you ask him why he would do that, he wouldn't say, oh, because he's gonna save the body there so he could drink the blood later because he's a vampire. No, given, the culture and the folklore of that time period, it was more likely impaling was part of the process, because if a Strigoi gets that body, they're pinned there. There's nothing they can do. They're safe. So it's kind of funny how he ended up being portrayed as, this vampire, when in fact he was probably doing something that would prevent the aspect of vampires coming to life. This leads us to need to talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? This guy did no research on Transylvania. He did no research on our boy Vlad at all, He just read about his bloody wars and figured this bloodthirsty monster would make a pretty good vampire, right? Stoker even thought that Dracul translated to devil, which was really the nail in the coffin for everything he needed in order for him to be the vampire in the story. But Dracul actually translates to dragon, so that part wasn't even right. But it doesn't really matter, because from that, boom, we got Dracula. And from Dracula, we got, the portrayal of vampires for all the years to come. It just changed the game, I just think it's a bit ridiculous. Our Strigois, they just started out, just a couple of rambunctious fools just stealing some milk, and now we have Twilight. So there's that. And I guess that's enough for me. So, okay, bye.